I'll be reading from chapter 10 of my novel, my first novel, The Death of Francis Stevens. Chapter 10 takes place 6 months after Francis Stevens was murdered in a parking structure of a hospital where he worked as a doctor, as a surgeon. There's two central characters that take place in this chapter. It's Ruth, the overbearing, overprotective mother, and Abigail, the very troubled teenage daughter. And right now, what's happening is Ruth's life is slipping out of her. She's trying to handle all these things, and every part of her life is falling apart. She's trying to deal with her daughter, and that relationship is getting very, very worse. So here I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to try to fill in the blanks of what I just said, chapter 10. 6 months after Francis Stevens died, Ruth nearly completed the first draft of her novel, The Afterlife. And during the day, she continued to write and drink, and sometimes at night, when she couldn't sleep, Ruth would lie awake in the moonlit bedroom, listening to the floors creaking and doors closing in other parts of the house, and she really didn't care about that ghost stuff. She really only cared when she was out of scotch. And on a certain evening, when Ruth completed the last chapter of her first draft, she discovered that she was completely out of scotch. She brushed her teeth and got into her Lexus SUV and drove to the market, and during the drive, she knew she was a miserable drunk of a mother. And she hurried to the liquor section in the market and placed 2 bottles of scotch in her shopping cart, and Ruth was suddenly overcome with depression and loneliness. And it was during those bouts of depression and loneliness that she needed to speak to someone so she could bitch about her life and her daughter. She tried her best to shake off this feeling as she stepped in the frozen food section and pulled out 2 overpriced frozen pizzas and 2 cartons of mint and chip ice cream and put them in her shopping cart. She paid for her items and watched as one of the baggers placed her items inside the shopping cart. She rolled the cart to her Lexus SUV and opened the hatchback and placed the groceries in the back and closed the hatchback and pushed the cart into some unknown direction of the parking lot and got into her Lexus SUV and sat in the driver's seat. She listened to the silence and forgot what it was like to be kissed and to make love. She sometimes thought about being touched when she was lying alone in bed. She was almost 45 years old and she still desired someone to be inside of her and to kiss her. The fantasy momentarily filled her mind, and then she became depressed again. She found it quite strange that she could be fine one moment and terrible the next. Yes, Ruth could have obtained pills from a quack doctor since she was still trying to get over a death in the family. However, she relied on her 2 new bottles of scotch to take care of her problems. Now in the driver's seat, Ruth searched through her purse and finally discovered Norm's business card, which she received the same day that she kicked her daughter out of the house. Ruth dialed Norm's office number and left a voicemail stating that she needed to discuss her daughter. She was sure that Norm would call her in a few days. She drove home depressed and lonely and wanting another glass of scotch. Ruth filled her glass when she arrived home, and she wanted to stay busy and she was tired of writing for the day, so she began folding clothes that were in the dryer, and that is when she heard the floor creak behind her, and she shivered from the sudden chill. And then she heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind her. She instantly turned, but she didn't see anyone. She was now freaked out for a second. She resumed folding her clothes when she discovered some of Abigail's t-shirts and socks and wondered how they ended up in the dryer since she hadn't been home for a few weeks. Ruth entered Abigail's dark bedroom with the folded clothes and turned on the light. She instantly felt the cold air in the bedroom. She put away Abigail's clothes in the mostly empty drawers. She walked to the bedroom window and opened the curtains and looked out in the dark backyard. And she remembered looking through the same window on a Sunday morning when Abigail was 5 years old. She remembered Abigail and Francis tossing gold-colored leaves at each other on the grass in the backyard. Now, Ruth yanked the curtains closed and wanted to forget about her daughter and her dead husband. She was about to leave the bedroom when she noticed a framed picture of Francis and Abigail on the wall. Abigail was 8 years old, blowing out the lit candles on the birthday cake, and their father was sitting next to her in the picture. The year was 2003. and Abigail Stevens was the happiest girl in the world with her father. Ruth had seen this picture on the wall many times before, but now this picture had new meaning. As Ruth continued to study the picture, she noticed a moving shadow in the reflection of the glass. She turned around, but nobody was there again. Ruth turned off the light, left Abigail's bedroom, and entered her bedroom and turned on the lamp on her nightstand, and put her folded clothes on the dresser and studied her image in the mirror, which was partially highlighted by the circle of yellow lamplight across the room. She pulled at the lumbering bags under her eyes. Ruth felt old inside and defeated. She realized that her life had officially fallen apart. She secretly wondered if her life would become any worse. Yet, that was a question that she was afraid to ask. She started to believe that she was dying inside, and maybe death had found her and was allowing her to die slowly. She lost her husband and a job that she had for over 20 years, and now her daughter was doing drugs and having sex with an older man. Why couldn't she date an Ivy League scholar, she thought. Shame on her. Ruth felt like she had lost everything, and her life had been reduced to living alone and listening to mysterious noises in her house while she was writing a manuscript that may never get published. Her life was sinking to the very bottom of hell as her teenage daughter was living with an older man. And then her cell phone rang. Ruth grabbed her cell phone from the bed without looking at the incoming phone number, since she assumed that it was her daughter wanting to come home and beg for forgiveness. And instead, when she answered the phone, she heard the voice of Norm Jacobs, Abigail's high school counselor. 15 minutes later, Ruth hung up the phone, applied lipstick, put on a sweater, drove to Denny's on Lincoln and Colorado Boulevard in Santa Monica. She knew meeting Norm was strictly for emergency purposes. Ruth met Norm in the front lobby area, and they shook hands and sat in a corner booth and ate cheap diner food. And then Ruth finally said, after a sluggish conversation, "I think this is all my fault." "What do you mean?" Norm asked. "You don't know me, Norm. I cheated on my husband. I was 30 years old. What did I know? I thought I knew every damn thing. Abigail was only 5 when it happened." "Ruth, that was in the past," Norm responded. "That's all that matters now." No, it's not. It's right in front of me," Ruth said. "But you made the family work." "I kicked Abigail out of my house, Norm. What kind of mother would kick her own flesh and blood out of the house?" "What?" Norm asked. "You have to get her back." "She needs you." "I understand," Ruth said. "You need to call the police. That'll just make things worse," Ruth said. They continued to speak for a few more minutes about the situation, and then Norm paid for the bill, and they walked out of the diner. Yet before they exited the booth, Ruth felt the chill, and it was the same feeling that she had felt in her house for the past 6 months. But she had ignored it now. Norm walked Ruth to her Lexus SUV, and there was an awkward moment. It was a moment they both hadn't felt in many years. "I'm sorry for bothering you with my problems," Ruth said. "I'm glad you called," Norm replied. They kissed softly and said goodnight. Ruth sat in the driver's seat of her dark car and felt that same chill again, and then she felt the presence. But now, there was something on her mind. She started her car and noticed it was 9:29 p.m. on the dashboard. She drove from the parking lot of the diner, and 10 minutes later, she arrived at the Rite Aid parking lot and instantly discovered Danny's green 1973 Pontiac Trans Am. She parked and turned off her headlights and noticed Abigail walking out of Rite Aid in her uniform. She got inside her friend's car, or she got inside Danny's car, and he sped from the parking lot. Ruth followed Danny to his apartment a few miles away from the store. Ruth parked across the street and watched as Danny and Abigail emerged from the Trans Am in front of a set of apartment garages. They held hands as they entered the downstairs apartment, and Ruth officially knew where her daughter was residing, and there was nothing stopping Ruth from banging on the front door and demanding her daughter to come home and finish her education at the public high school. And at this very moment, Ruth thought about how she forced her daughter to change schools in the middle of the school year and to get a part-time job. Now, everything backfired. She wondered if she would be in this situation if she had to get her way all the time. But Ruth had to focus on the current situation, though. Could she just barge into Danny's apartment? Who knows? She may get shot. And what would intruding on their space accomplish but piss off her daughter? So Ruth drove home and laid awake in her bed, yet she realized she had to deal with the source of the problem. So in the morning, Ruth drove to Danny's apartment and waited in her car for a few hours, and Danny appeared holding his white collar shirt, and he got into his car. Ruth started her Lexus SUV and followed Danny to a Chinese restaurant in Hollywood. She parked at the far end of the parking lot and noticed Rocky entering the Trans Am, and a few minutes later, Rocky left and drove away. Ruth finally knew that Danny was buying or selling drugs. Danny emerged from his Trans Am holding his white collar shirt and approached the restaurant. Ruth watched him and waited. She needed an element of surprise. Ruth waited for a few minutes and then finally entered the musty smelling Chinese restaurant and looked around and noticed Danny, who was now wearing a white collar shirt, and he was taking an order from a table of Japanese businessmen. He finished writing the order and walked toward the kitchen when he discovered Ruth. She quickly approached him and said, "I want my daughter back." "You kicked her out, remember that?" Danny asked. He was nervous, and worst of all, she was ruining his cocaine high. "Do you want me to notify the police that you're having sex with a minor? How would that look when the police pull you out of this place in handcuffs? You think you'll get another job again? You think you can come in here and threaten me?" Danny knew customers and other waiters were starting to look at them, but he needed to put Ruth in her place. "Look, Motormouth, I know you deal in drugs. I saw that loser leave your car, and I bet I know what you're doing with my daughter in your place. I just want her back, that's all. You can go back to your cave and mess up your own life, but I want her back, that's it. I guess you're getting dementia in your old age. You kicked her out. What kind of mother would do something like that?" Danny walked away and entered the kitchen, and customers and employees were staring at Ruth. She finally turned and left the place and got into her Lexus SUV and realized that she had one more thing to do before she returned to her house in Santa Monica. Now at this moment, hazy afternoon sunlight glowed within the dirty white curtains that hung above the green couch, where Abigail sat and snorted another line of coke on Danny's glass table. She was high and enjoyed the rebellious life of ditching class, living with her older boyfriend, and having sex and snorting coke. And then she heard a knock on the front door. Somebody was after her. Abigail stood up quickly and nearly knocked the cocaine on the floor. She freaked out. Maybe it's the cops ready to bash in the door, she thought. She quickly scooped the cocaine into a small secure envelope that was constructed with magazine paper and hid it under the couch. She checked the peephole in the door, but she couldn't really see who it was except that it was some old woman outside. She opened the door to discover her mother. They were both clearly lost without each other, but that didn't matter right now. "What are you doing here?" Abigail snapped. "I need you back, Abby. I do. I swear," Ruth said. You got rid of me. Remember that? I'm sorry, I swear. I was just overwhelmed and you weren't behaving." "I'm not leaving," Abigail said. She was sickened by her mother, but she was also confused. "If you don't leave this guy, he's going to do something terrible. I feel it in my bones, Abby. He's not a good person. You have to trust me." "I couldn't trust you since I was 5 years old. I remember what you did to Dad." "Please don't say that, Abby. It's not fair," Ruth said. Abigail slammed the door in her mother's face. In the next 40 or so minutes, Ruth sat in her Lexus SUV and cried within afternoon shadows. She officially felt abandoned. Ruth realized that she made life worse by kicking her daughter out of the house. Now, she wanted her daughter back, and she did everything she possibly could to get her daughter back without making things worse. Yes, Ruth Stevens begged and pleaded with her daughter, and she could have called the police and reported that her daughter was possibly doing drugs and possibly having sex with an older man. But she couldn't get herself to call the police on her daughter. Any questions? Got time for questions? No, it doesn't look like I have any.